Hello and welcome back to my channel In Search of Wonder. My name is Anne and this is my weekly wrap-up. So I spent significant time in the car, not driving, passenger, yesterday and today, and so I managed to finish not one but two books and make progress on a third, which I may or may not finish tomorrow in time to get this video out. But at the very least, I will share my thoughts about the two novels that I finished. And both of them are part of my Victober reading challenge that I mentioned in my TBR video. And the first one, actually, I started in September. It was part of my September reading TBR, but it took me all the way into this month. Little Dorrit by Dickens. So this was such a good book. I had not read any Dickens for a long time, so it was fun to read one again, and I remembered why I love Dickens so much. I just love his way with words and his descriptions of things, and I love how he gives each character their own unique persona and way of speaking and speech patterns, etc. And even though he has many characters that come in and out of his story, they're each very clearly defined by certain mannerisms or things they wear or things that they say a lot or patterns of speech, etc. So they become very memorable, and you may not remember their name when he mentions their name, but then when they start talking, or when they start, like one character, Mr. Panks, he's always pulling on his corkscrew hair. So he's always pulling on his hair. As soon as he mentions that, you're like, oh yeah, that's Mr. Panks. Or another character, Mr. Myrtle, he is always tugging on his coat sleeves or tucking his hands into his sleeves like this, and always looking at the floor and studiously avoiding actual conversation with anyone. So you remember who he is. You may not remember his name, but you remember when it starts talking about him. My favorite such character, though, was Flora, who was briefly at one point when young engaged to marry one of our main characters, Arthur Clenham. But then he went away overseas and she ended up marrying someone else who passed away. And so they happened to meet again as grown adults, some decades later, a couple decades later probably. So when he introduces her, it's like automatically, you know her, you know this woman. So her name is Flora. Flora, always tall, had grown to be very broad too, and short of breath, but that was not much. Flora, whom he had left a lily, had become a peony, but that was not much. Flora, who had seemed enchanting in all she said and thought, was diffuse and silly. That was much. Flora, who had been spoiled and artless long ago, was determined to be spoiled and artless now. That was a fatal blow. This is Flora. So, then every time Flora talks, oh my goodness, it's like this stream of consciousness, and it's so funny, and it's such like a garbled mix of words, and he doesn't use any commas hardly ever in her passages, which if you know Dickens, you know that's a big thing. Let's see. Okay, so in the original meeting again of Arthur Clenham and Flora, previously described, here is one passage of her lengthy. This is probably one of her more understandable ones. So here we go. Then it's all true, and they really do. Good gracious, Arthur, pray excuse me, old habit, Mr. Clenham, far more proper. What a country to live in for so long a time, and with so many lanterns and umbrellas, too. How very dark and wet the climate ought to be, and no doubt actually is. And the sums of money that must be made by those two trades, where everybody carries them and hangs them everywhere. The little shoes, too, and the feet screwed back in infancy is quite surprising. What a traveler you are! Dear, dear, said Flora. Only to think of the changes at home Arthur cannot overcome. It seems so natural. Mr. Clennam, far more proper. Since you became familiar with the Chinese customs and language, which I am persuaded you speak like a native, if not better, for you were always quick and clever, though immensely difficult, no doubt. I am sure the teachers alone would kill me if I tried. Such changes, Arthur, I am doing it again, seems so natural, most improper, as no one could have believed. Who could have ever imagined Mrs. Finching when I can't imagine it myself? And there we have Flora. So, fun characters, fun depictions of said characters in this story. Throughout this story, I noticed from the very beginning, there was a contrast of light and dark, and also good and evil. And for example, there were some patriarchal types of characters, and some of them were bad, and then some of them were good. And there were 2 prisoners at the beginning of the story, and it became very obvious in the chapter about them that one of them was genuinely a criminal and a bad person, and the other one was good. And that is developed throughout the story. So there's always this contrast of 2 different types of people in a similar position, but bad versus good. There's a comparison of the main character, little Dorrit, whose family, every other member of her family is extremely narcissistic. They are all using and abusing her because she is of a quieter, sweeter, more tender-hearted nature. And so they're always taking advantage of her. At the same time, always criticizing her and always wanting her to be more like them. But if she were more like them, they would never have treated her that way, by the way. But little Dorrit, Amy is her name, she always responds to them with love and forgiveness and kindness and an attitude of service, which in some ways it's a little bit unreal in a sense, but in another way, it's actually very well drawn, because I think that it's much more true in a certain sense, to a certain extent, of abusive relationships like that, from my observation, where they believe what the abuser is saying of them, and they think that they are in the wrong, and so they're always seeking to make it right and to do right and to be right. Amy Dorrit has, because she's the heroine of this story, there is more to her than that. There's a bigger strength of character going on there. And once she is freed from them, which that's another theme, I'll get to that in a second. Once she is freed from them, she's able to more fully grow into her strength of character that she possesses. And there's a development of that throughout the story as the story goes on. But as long as she is in the context of her family circle, she just takes what they give her. But I feel like Dickens does a very good job. It's not fun to read, but he does a very good job of this type of abusive narcissistic relationship from both sides, and kind of digging a little bit into the whys of people behaving in that way toward one another, and very well drawn. But what's interesting is he contrasts Amy Dorrit in her genuinely abusive situation and her response to it. He contrasts that with 2 other girls, one who is a grown woman at this point in the story, who, and that's the one I'll focus on here, because she's the primary contrast with Amy Dorrit. She is a hard, unforgiving, bitter woman. And you see that from the very beginning. You see that contrast in her. Like I said, there's this contrast. So you see that in her from the very beginning of the story. And then she, as she goes on through the story, and you hear a little bit more from her perspective and what's going on with her, you come to realize that basically she had a difficult start to her life. There's no doubt about that. in an unfortunate situation, not really having a true family or, you know, a family unit that loved her and took care of her. But instead of overcoming that with strength of character, she allowed it to embitter her, and that bitterness colored everything that anyone said and did to her. So even though by most people she was treated kindly throughout her life, and people put up with her bad temper and her haughty demeanor and her bitter spirit, and tried to help her and tried to love on her, everything she saw in them was colored by her bitterness. And so she saw everything they did of her as mistreatment, and she saw it as abuse. And in her mind, everyone treated her poorly, and everyone abused her and did wrong by her. And the contrast of the two, I thought, was really very well done and also very appropriate, because I think the same sort of thing still happens today. Often what happens, the people who are in abusive relationships don't even realize that they are being abused half the time, or a large portion of the time. And then at the other time, you have people who are quick to cry abuse or label some kind of behavior as abusive or you know, hurting their feelings or harmful to them or whatever, when really it's not. Someone may have expressed their opinion more or less unkindly or said something in disagreement with them, but it wasn't actual abuse. So I think that jumped out at me. A huge theme that, you know, was it just obvious. So the whole book is about imprisonment. I mean, the main family, the first half of the story, they are held in the Marshalsea debtors prison, and actually the story kind of begins and ends more or less in a prison. And so imprisonment is a huge theme, but I feel like what is missed frequently in conversation about this is there is a theme running along with that of forgiveness contrasting bitterness, which is how Amy Dorrit was able to overcome the abuse that she experienced with a forgiving spirit. But this other woman, Miss Wade is her name, she was not able to overcome even the positive treatment she received in her life, because she had an unforgiving and bitter spirit and attitude. And it's not just those two characters which the contrast is played out. Arthur Clenham, so the man in the story, his mother, she is a key part of the plot and what happens in the story, which is kind of convoluted and a little bit confusing, especially as it wraps up at the end. But what is driving her part in the story is bitterness of spirit and unforgiveness, because her husband committed adultery early on in their relationship, possibly even like before they were married. It wasn't 100% clear on that, and she never forgave him or the other woman, and became a very hard and bitter woman because of it. And in the end of the story, in a kind of a climactic scene, she and Amy Dorrit meet up. And what Amy Dorrit says to her, little Dorrit says to her, I think is kind of the key to the story and what's going on here. So she says, "Oh, Mrs. Clenham, said little Dorrit, angry feelings and unforgiving deeds are no comfort and no guide to you and me. My life has been passed in this poor prison, and my teachings have been very defective. But let me implore you to remember later and better days. Be guided only by the healer of the sick, the raiser of the dead, the friend of all who were afflicted and forlorn, the patient master who shed tears of compassion for our infirmities. We cannot but be right if we put all the rest away and do everything in remembrance of him. There is no vengeance and no infliction of suffering in his life, I'm sure. There can be no confusion in following him and seeking for no other footsteps, I am certain." So I thought that was a beautiful and excellent way to wrap up the whole story. So those are my thoughts about Little Dorrit. And as for the other book I finished, that is Through the Looking Glass. which I had previously started, so I only had to read about half of it, so it didn't take me long. And it's a bit of a wild ride. It moves at such a fast pace, so it's a little hard to keep up with, and a little bit disjointed maybe in that sense, but really very, very cleverly written story. I was really admiring that aspect of it. And it struck me that so much of this story is about language and meaning. There are so many plays on words here, and a lot of playing around with the concept of understanding and the meaning that we attach to words and where that meaning comes from, etc. Starting with when Alice gets into this looking glass, she sees the poem Jabberwocky, and when she sees it, it's written in mirror writing, so she has to hold it up to the mirror to read it. And then as the story goes on, obviously it's a little bit difficult to understand the poem because it uses archaic language and made up words, and so she doesn't really understand it even once she's able to read it. But then halfway through the book, which I think is important, she meets Humpty Dumpty. They have a very interesting discussion about language and words and meaning. He asks her what her name is, and she says her name is Alice, and he says it's a stupid name. What does it mean? And she's like, does it need to mean something? And Humpty Dumpty says, of course it must. And then later on, he goes on to say, though, that he can say any word he wants and make it mean whatever he wants it to mean. Like he says, he's talking about words. He says, when I use a word, it means just what I choose it to mean, neither more nor less. And the question is, said Alice, whether you can make words mean so many different things. The question is, said Humpty Dumpty, which is to be master, that's all. Alice was too much puzzled to say anything, so after a minute, Humpty Dumpty began again. They've a temper, some of them, particularly verbs. They're the proudest. Adjectives you can do anything with, but not verbs. However, I can manage the whole lot of them. Impenetrability, that's what I say. Would you tell me, please, said Alice, what that means? Now you talk like a reasonable child, said Humpty Dumpty, looking very much pleased. I meant by impenetrability that we've had enough of that subject, and it would be just as well if you'd mention what you mean to do next, as I suppose you don't mean to stop here all the rest of your life. That's a great deal to make one word mean, Alice said in a thoughtful tone. When I make a word do a lot of work like that, said Humpty Dumpty, I always pay it extra. Anyway, language plays a huge part in this story, which I was really enjoying. And I was really enjoying all of the puns and the plays on words where, you use one word in one context, and then, the other person in the dialogue misunderstands it to have a different meaning. And it was like, well, that doesn't make sense, what you're saying. Anyway, very great. Some very funny moments, but also just intriguing. I enjoyed that one. That's it, and I will see you next time. I am about to meet my sisters for a coffee and chocolate festival. Like, if there were books there, then it would be like the most perfect festival in the world, but it's pretty close, so I'll take it. But I'm a few minutes early, so I thought I would finish my weekly wrap-up by mentioning the third book that I finished this week. I finished it last night. I finished reading Glass Town, which is, first of all, a graphic novel, which I never read. And every time I open it up to read it, my sons were like, what are you reading, Mom? Like, is that manga or something? I was like, no, it's not. It's a graphic novel. And hello, I can read graphic novels if I want to. Anyways, so graphic novel, first of all. And it was inspired by the stories that the Bronte siblings wrote when they were children, teenagers. Actually, they wrote them, I think, into their adulthood, their young adulthood. They wrote stories about these imaginary worlds that they created. So fun. I would really be very interested to read like maybe a psychologist's perspective on their stories and what they created and their very, very rich internal imaginary lives that they led. I feel like they were really on that border between healthy imagination and unhealthy imagination. I'm not sure they ever quite crossed that line, but anyways, very, very fertile imaginations throughout their lives, especially as children. It just seemed to flourish. And they've created these imaginary worlds peopled with characters from their imagination, but also characters from real life that they embellished, like the Duke of Wellington, I think. Anyway, so let's see, Isabel Greenberg took this idea and made a graphic novel of it. But it's not just a graphic novel version of the Bronte juvenilia. It is a very poignant story, starting with Charlotte in the period of her life after all of her siblings have passed away, and she is the only one left. And one of the characters that she created in her imagination comes back to her and says, hey, let's go revisit Glasstown, which is the town that she and her brother Branwell had invented and made stories about. And so basically she's reminiscing and remembering what it was like, but not only reminiscing about the stories that she created with her siblings and the worlds that she created with them, but also thinking back through her life and her life with her siblings and some of the regrets that she had and some of the things that she enjoyed, and just reflecting back on her life with her siblings. And I found it very poignant and compelling. And I loved that the pictures are kind of very almost crude, like childlike drawings. And also the colors reflect the mood of the moment. So the ones where Charlotte is in the present, where she's alone and she's reminiscing, are kind of like gray and gloomy, but then Glasstown is all bright and colorful and filled with color. So really well done artwork, and I just thoroughly enjoyed it. I'm going to see if I can show you some of the pages. I read it on my Kindle. I borrowed it from the library. And I can't show you here because I'm getting a glare from the reflective screen, but I'll see if I can capture some pictures or show you some video of some of the pages, what it looks like. But that is the third book that I read. Really enjoyed it. Highly recommend it if you can get your hands on a copy. And that's it for this week. Have a great week. All right, this is the best I can do. So, there you go. Very cool.